Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having me back. My son is actually 3 years old now, and I think if I showed him that video with all the ready mix trucks, that'd just about make his year. He absolutely loves it. So maybe I should bring him to next year's conference. The presentation today is called Shaking BC's Economic Foundations. The reason is that Donald Trump was inaugurated, and he's really added to our economic woes. I'll say at the outset that I am actually optimistic, even though the data may not give any immediate cause for that. I'm optimistic that we are more concerned about our economic sovereignty and our national sovereignty in a way that I haven't certainly seen in the time that I've lived in Canada. And that makes me think that we're actually reaching a point where we haven't turned the corner, but at least we're acknowledging that maybe there's a corner that needs to be turned. So first of all, to summarise the whole presentation in one slide, it's that we had homegrown challenges coming into this year, some very, very serious problems with our economy. It was being propped up by population growth and public spending, neither of which were sustainable. So that all predates Donald Trump. Now Donald Trump comes along and he says, don't base yourself as a company north of the 49th parallel, base yourself in the US, where you have guaranteed access to the US market. He's been very explicit about that. And that's a real challenge for us, because our value proposition in Canada has always been that we have Westminster institutions, rule of law, we have an educated workforce, we have natural resources and guaranteed access to the United States. And now that's in question, right? And we've got the USMCA being renegotiated in 2026, being reviewed, I should say. And so there could be some changes in market access that flow from that. So that's a big challenge for us. It's important to realise that whatever happens, even if tariffs went away tomorrow, we have seen a step down in our living standards over the past few years, and that is a permanent one. There is no plan to bring that back. No government is proposing that we're going to recover those living standards. They're permanently lost. The challenge I think that we need to face up to is, what is our value proposition here in Canada now? Why should a company base and build their operations here rather than in the US or elsewhere? Why should a skilled worker want to base and build their family in British Columbia or in Canada? That's, I think, the challenge that all policymakers need to be thinking about when they're setting tax policies, regulatory policies, and the like. So what are those homegrown challenges? Well, I'm an economist, so I could talk about economic data all day long, but I'm not going to start with that. I'm going to start with some polling data. So this is some polling data on satisfaction with the standard of living from Greg Lyle and at Innovative Research Group. And what that shows is that basically across all generations, if you polled them in 2007 and polling them last year, all generations have seen a decrease in their level of satisfaction with the standard of living in Canada, and particularly Gen XYZ. And so that's why you're seeing these big shifts among the 18 to 35s in terms of voting patterns, because they're not seeing a prosperous future for themselves. The baby boomers and the silent generation, they're retired. They've sort of made they've made their way in the world and are feeling fairly secure. So they're still reasonably happy with the standard of living in Canada, but younger generations less so. Another data point that kind of bothers me is when I look at the food bank data, we've seen a near doubling of monthly visits to food banks in Canada over the past 5 years. 1/3 of those visits involve children under the age of 18, who are only 17% of the population. So, people are not doing very well out there. A country can't redistribute income it doesn't generate in the first place. And our economy is not really generating very much income. Once you adjust for population, Canada's economy is essentially the same size as it was a decade ago. We've seen almost no growth. We've had the second lowest growth in per capita GDP among the 38 member countries of the OECD. So these are the advanced countries in the world. So GDP just stands for domestic product. It's the total income that households and businesses produce in a year. And when I say per capita, that means just divided by the population. So it's how much income we're all generating as households and as businesses in the total economy, shared amongst ourselves on average. So, 0.2% growth per annum over the past 10 years. I've got some comparisons there. The United States has been growing closer to 2% per annum. The OECD average is much higher. You've got Australia, which is another natural resource-based economy and a great producer of economists and accents. And then we've got Brexit affecting the United Kingdom, and yet the United Kingdom has actually even beaten out Canada as well. So even without Brexit, we weren't able to beat the United Kingdom. So the economy is just simply not generating very much income. Most of the GDP growth that you see is just population growth, which again is not sustainable. If you break up the components of the economy, so you'll notice that this is relative to 2014. You notice there's been a massive increase in government spending per capita. And it's actually much greater than the increase in private spending or household spending per capita. What about the rest of the private sector? Well, you've got exports actually lower than they were a decade ago. Residential construction's lower than a decade ago on a per person basis. And then business investment on a per capita basis is down 25% lower than it was in 2014. You're not going to have higher living standards as a country if businesses are investing 1/4 less than they were a decade ago. And then you see the black line there is GDP per person, which is barely up over the whole period. So again, adjusted for population, the economy is simply not growing. It's going sideways. BC had been doing a little bit of the country because of the mega projects, Trans Mountain, Site C, Coastal GasLink, LNG Canada. But those all sort of tapped out in 2022, and there really hasn't been anything to drive the economy forward in the last 2 years. So this is, again, GDP per capita. You can see BC's economy shrank by about 2% last year, adjusted for population, and then it shrank by 1% the previous year. So essentially, the economic pie that we all get to share has been shrinking for 2 straight years. Now, if you go back a little bit further, you'll see the diamonds, the orange diamonds. We managed 0.2% over the past 5 years, which isn't great, but it is better than most other provinces in Canada. Again, that's those mega projects that were lifting us up, which have all finished. Over the longer term, so if you go back to 1997, what's the average rate of per capita GDP growth? It's 1.3, right? So nearly 1.5% a year. And we've only managed 0.2 over the past 5, and then shrinking over the past 2 straight years. If we look at where the economy is doing well, not doing well, okay, so here we've got a graph of GDP growth by industry, and I've got population growth shown there. So if you've got population growth of 3%, surely you've got 3% potential customers, 3% more consumers, 3% more workers. Everything should just sort of go up by 3%. The economy should just get 3% bigger. But it didn't. The population went up by 3%. The economy only grew by 1.2%. So in per capita terms, it shrank by 1.8%, as I showed you on the previous slide. There's only a few parts of the economy that are growing faster than the population. And they're mostly in the public sector. So health, education, and public administration have been booming. I think I've got professional services there. So lawyers, consultants, often to government, the film and TV sector, which is a subsidised industry. But there's not much else after that. And then some parts of the economy last year shrank outright. So they were contracting outright, so that's construction and manufacturing. So yeah, most parts of the private sector in BC are growing slower than the population. That's not a good sign. What have I got here? Okay. So, when I showed you that Canadian data, you see this dichotomy between the private sector and the public sector. You see the same thing in British Columbia. Private sector's not doing very well. The public sector, it's really been the go-go days. And then when you look at the labour market, well, where are the jobs being created? So on the left-hand side, you've got private sector jobs, and on the right-hand side, you've got public sector jobs. And then you've got the pre-pandemic trend shown there. So we've been stuck in terms of private sector jobs at around 2.2, 2.3 million workers. Relative to the pre-pandemic trend, we're sort of missing about 300,000 private sector jobs. And then in the public sector, we've gone from about 470,000 public sector workers to 600,000 public sector workers. Relative to our pre-pandemic trend, we've got an extra 100,000 public sector workers. So we're missing 300,000 private sector workers. We've gained an extra 100,000 public sector workers above trend. So put it all together, total employment is about 200,000 workers shy of where it would be if it had just stuck to its pre-pandemic trend. So again, this just supports the overall story that private sector not doing too well, public sector has been going gangbusters. This is a chart showing employment growth over 2019 to 2024 between the private sector and the public sector. Again, public sector, education, health, public administration, the orange bars, have been doing very, very well. And then the private sector are the blue bars. Most parts have not been very, very strong. Professional services, I mentioned earlier, have been doing well. Film and TV, lawyers, consultants. Private education, which has been a play upon the government's immigration, federal government's immigration excursions. That's not sustainable. And then the rest of the private sector has been doing pretty poorly in terms of employment growth by sector. What have we got here? Now, in terms of non-residential construction, commercial and I'm trying to read my own chart. Commercial and industrial have been trending lower, but we've got some pretty strong capex from government spending. The government's running a $20 billion capital plan, and so we have been seeing decent building permits in the institutional sector, government sector, schools, hospitals, and so forth. Here we go. And then in the residential sector, well, this sector has traditionally been about 2.5% of GDP, and it ballooned up to about 3.5% of GDP when interest rates were on the deck during the pandemic. It's now in a moderation period. It's been really cooling off, and so starts have come down. I've got them by ownership structure on the left, and I've got them by market type on the right. Rentals, very strong. Again, that's a public sector story because the public sector has been underwriting a lot of rental construction. This data is probably quite lagging because we hear that the pre-sales market is extremely weak in BC, and starts are only recorded when construction's already underway. So this may be a little bit lagging. And then just in terms of concrete manufacturing and aggregates, which added all together is about 0.4% of BC's economy. Just to say that construction's been moderating a little bit over the most recent data. Okay. All right, so we had the first fiscal update from the province last Monday, letting us know that GDP growth is going to be weaker than they first thought. Over the last decade, the economy grew by about 3% a year, 2.9% a year, just in terms of top-line GDP growth. Not adjusted for population, just top-line GDP growth. In the budget, we've been expecting closer to 2%, which is not great, but it's still better than sort of 1.5% is where we are now with the impact of the tariffs and so forth. So the government is expecting a weaker outlook. But even if all those tariffs went away tomorrow, all the disputes with the United States were resolved, let's have a look at what's happening to per capita GDP. So again, this is just a measure of the economic pie growing over time. Here's the pre-pandemic trend that we were on. We had the pandemic in 2020. We bounced back out of that, supported by the big projects. which finished in 2022. And then since then, GDP per capita has declined in the past 2 years. But you see how far we are away from that trend line. There's no plan to get back to it. It's a permanent loss in our standard of living. And the impact of the tariffs has been to shift us from the blue line. The impact of the tariffs has been to shift us from the blue line to the orange line. So it makes that situation a little bit worse. What does that mean in real coin? It means, I think I can see the number there, it means that we're about $4,500 per head of population away from where we would have been if we'd stayed on the pre-pandemic track. Okay, there's about 2.5 people a household, so multiply 4,500 by 2.5, you know, and that's what you're looking at in terms of what it's going to cost, you know, per household across the economy. So it is a permanent step down in living standards of about $4,500 per head. And these aren't my numbers. This is straight out of the government's fiscal update that came out last Monday. In terms of the fiscal plan, BC has traditionally run a fairly conservative budget situation. That was the same under the BC Liberals. It was the same under John Horgan and Carol James when she was the finance minister. So it's not an NDP BC Liberals thing. We've tended to operate with balanced budgets over time. During the COVID pandemic emergency, we ran a deficit of $5.6 billion, which is 1.8% of GDP. That deficit is now close to $12 billion, or 2.7% of GDP. Is it 2.6? Sorry, 2.6% of GDP. So we're running a deficit larger than during COVID, significantly larger than COVID. It's also the largest deficit in the country. And we're expected to run a $12 billion deficit next year and the year after as well. You know, this last year, that deficit was only supposed to be 6.7 billion. Now it's 12. So the fiscal situation in BC is deteriorating very quickly. Compared to other provinces, our deficit is 2.6% of GDP. There's an accounting measure that the government included, which is a tobacco case settlement. They're going to get about $3.5 billion over 18 years. They elected to book all of it in 1 year, even though they're not going to get the money for over the next 18. They've elected to book all of that money this fiscal year. So that actually makes it look a little bit better than it is. But you know, either way, it's either 2.6% of GDP or 3.2% of GDP. It's still by far the largest budget deficit in the country with no end in sight. So where is this coming from? So I went back to some previous budgets, budget 22, 3, 4, 5, and then this last update on Monday. And it doesn't matter whether you look at the operating side of the budget or you look at, for operating expenses, or you look at the capital expenses. Each time we've got an update, the entire line of spending has just shifted up. So we've just really not been minding our spending. And then in the last update that we had on Monday, we've got the revenue line sort of collapsed because of the slower economic growth and the removal of the consumer carbon tax. So, you know, there is a bit of a concern about this. All of this is borrowed money. This is provincial debt. It took us 12 years to double provincial debt from 2010 to 2012. We're going to double provincial debt again in 4 years, from 2022 to 2026. So all of this increase in spending is just borrowed, which is, again, a pretty negative signal for businesses about basing themselves in the province, or young people, young professionals about basing themselves here, knowing that taxes in the future are likely to be much, much higher to try and stabilise this situation. This is what happens to debt servicing. So on the chart on the left is the level of interest payments on government debt. We hit $7.5 billion by the end of the forecast horizon. On the right, it's expressed in per capita terms, so divide by the population. So traditionally, over the 2010s, British Columbians paid about $530 per head per year to service the government's interest on government debt. that number will rise to $1,300 by 2027, which is a pretty spectacular increase. So in per household terms, multiply by 2.5 people per household, that's about, everyone's going to be paying, every household's going to be paying on average about $3,100 a year just on interest to serve government debt. So this builds up pretty quickly. What are the ratings agencies saying about this? Well, up until July of 2021, British Columbia had a AAA credit rating from S&P Global. AAA just means you're sort of bulletproof. You're very, very strong. You can withstand any kind of external shock. We've had 4 consecutive downgrades in the last 4 years. We're now A+, but with a negative outlook. But the commentary was quite candid. They're saying that the province is at a turning point with respect to the management of its finances, and that BC would be the weakest of its peers, both internationally and domestically. And Moody's also underscored that our problems didn't really start with Donald Trump. Our fiscal deterioration is really a result of provincial policy choices, particularly spending, just runaway spending, which they view as evidence of declining governance. What does this mean? Well, there's only a few jurisdictions in the world that actually can issue. So there are the Australian states, there are the Swiss cantons. All right. Sure. Yeah, that's okay. There's only a few jurisdictions that can issue debt in their own name. Most places can't. Like if you think of a US state or a municipality, they can't run an operating deficit. The revenues have to match their expenditures each year. But if you're a national government or if you're a state government like BC, you can. So if you think of it in terms of our peers, we went from being a AAA rated province in July of 2021. So we were right up there with the left-hand panel there of some of the Swiss provinces, like Zurich, Western Australia, another resource-rich state. Now we're down here at, most of the Canadian provinces have really slipped over time, and now we're A+, but with a negative outlook. So one more downgrade, and we will join Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and Labrador. What does this mean? It means we're much more susceptible to external shocks. We're no longer, masters of our own ship. So to use an expression, and we've gone from having the fiscal strength of Zurich in 2021 to having almost the fiscal strength of Prince Edward Island, which is where we might be by 2026. At the moment, I think we're very much on track for another downgrade next year, and we will be right at the bottom at that point. So there are some concerns. Okay. Oh, there we are. Oh, sorry. Thought that had shown up. Yeah. So for sort of riches to rags in 4 or 5 years. Okay. So now there are homegrown challenges, and now Donald Trump gets inaugurated on the January 20th, and he disrupts global trade. The Bank of Canada expects the economy will slow pretty sharply in the middle part of this year. So a recession is not certain, but it's certainly in prospect. It's possible that the economy goes into recession in the middle of this year. We'll see. Hopefully it turns out a little bit more resilient than this, but certainly Donald Trump's policies and the slowdown in the global economy as a result of this trade dispute are sort of really compounding our problems. Okay. Right. Yeah, so to wrap up, we did come into this year with a lot of homegrown problems. The private sector economy, very, very weak. Our economy propped up by unsustainable public spending and unsustainable population growth. Now, compounding all of that, we've got the challenges from dealing with the disruptions of US policy, and we're much more hostage to fortune because of that. Even if all of those external pressures went away tomorrow, we have had a step down in living standards in Canada and in British Columbia, and it's important to recognise that's permanent. No government is proposing a plan to recover that loss of living standards that we've suffered over the past few years. and we're yet to really come up with a plan for that. We've done a lot of advocacy at the Business Council of BC. I'm very pleased to have Jason and Concrete BC as a member. And our advocacy has really been, can really boil down to that last statement there, which is that policymakers need to be applying this lens. Why would you base yourself as a business in Canada and BC rather than elsewhere? What is the value proposition that we can offer relative to elsewhere? Beautiful scenery, talented people, boundless resources. None of those are going to cut it. We need to have a policy environment that's more conducive to private sector economic activity. With that, I'm happy to take any questions and go from there.
Does anyone have any questions? Would that be good news?
There is good news. The good news is there were two scenarios the Bank of Canada was working with earlier in the year. One was bad and the other was really, really dark. And that second scenario seems unlikely to happen now. So things are bad, but they could have been a whole lot worse given, a 25%, tariff on everything and, 50% tariff on everything, these sorts of things that were being pushed out on Truth Social. It could have been a whole lot worse.
David, a great presentation. One of the slides you showed how Canada contrasted with the countries in Europe, and Ireland, I think, was right at #1.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk about how they're doing.
Well, yeah, Ireland's a bit of an outlier because it has a tax haven type of model where they try to have very low tax rates, so companies will book some of their profits there by R&D or their IP there. It's not a perfect comparison. That's why I sort of highlighted the United States, Australia, the UK, the OECD average, the Euro area average, because I think that's probably a better comparison point. And we're lower than all of those, significantly lower. Particularly the UK, who went through the disruption of Brexit, and we're growing at a third of their pace. Yeah.
When we get downgraded from AAA to AA plus and AA minus and AA, how does that affect our borrowing as far as interest rates? Like what's the jump in interest rates that we have to pay?
Yeah, we used to get a discount to Ontario. So whatever Ontario went to market with on their bonds, we would get 15 basis points less than that. That's what we would have to pay. Now we're paying a premium relative to Ontario bonds. I think it's about 6 basis points at the moment. But there's one caveat to that, which is that we're very tied to Canada's brand. So when we to try and sell our bonds to pay our bills, bondholders look at Canada first. What is the fiscal security of Canada? And then they look at the provinces after that. But the lion's share of it is Canada a good risk? Which really just underscores that, I think the federal government's been playing with fire for a number of years because we've had this very significant deterioration federally with our finances. We get the update, I think, on November 4th. We haven't had a budget update in Canada for a year and a half, which is quite amazing. The fiscal year began on the 1st of April, and we're not going to get a budget for this fiscal year until November the 4th. So I think we'll get quite a bit of scrutiny on that. But I think, to summarise, there are two parts. One is we are very much tied to the Federation and the fiscal credibility of the federal government. But relative to other provinces, we have lost a lot of ground. And so we are paying a bit more than we were before. Now we're not getting a discount, we're paying a premium to borrow.
Any other questions? Brian has a question.
Yeah.
What kind of policies can the government look at to make it BC more attractive for private sector investment?
Well, there's a number. Top of my list would be get the provincial sales tax off capital inputs. So the PST is an albatross of a tax. It's just really, it just costs you a lot of economic activity to raise the revenue because of the way it cascades through the supply chain. And we have the highest effective tax rate on new capital investment in Canada. It's about a quarter. So on the average new capital project, about a quarter of it is lost to tax, and most of that is because of the PST. In the rest of Canada, it's about 15% to 20%. So if we've got a project that has a pre-tax return that's higher here than it would be elsewhere, we'll still get the project. But if you've got a project that has the same pre-tax rate of return in BC versus another province, you know, our taxes aren't competitive. So that's a very obvious one. A second one is that, you know, our top marginal tax rate is 53.5 cents on the dollar, and it kicks in a bit over $200,000. That makes it really hard to attract business owners, entrepreneurs, high-skilled individuals, people that you could base and build a company around and could build a team around and expand, get into export markets. Because if they would base themselves in Washington, which is also a beautiful place, the top marginal rate there is 37%, and that kicks in around $700,000 or $800,000 US dollars. So they get higher market wages and lower tax rate. It just makes it really, really hard. The problem with taxing income so highly is it discourages people from earning the income in the first place. So you don't get the economic activity, you don't get the business growth, and the government doesn't get the revenue because it never takes place in the first place. So that would be two on my list. And a third, I think, would be to rethink the Clean BC timelines. You know, to try and shrink the economy in order to meet the GHG targets that they've set, which are incredibly ambitious. In a short period of time, you know, there's only really one channel they've got open to them, which is to slow the economy down. I mean, that's what's happening. You know, if you allow a bit more time, then technology can start to play a bit more of a role. Asset turnover, as companies reconfigure their operations as they're setting up when they're setting up new operations, they configure it in a more emissions efficient way. So you allow those mechanisms to play out. But when you're just going to say we're going to drop our emissions, absolutely. Oh, and by the way, we're going to expand the population by 3% a year, and all that population uses energy, but we're going to reduce absolute emissions by 40% relative to 2007, and we're going to do it in 6 years. Yeah, it's just really ambitious, and you've only got one tool, which is take a sledgehammer to the private sector economy.